Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.56 Modern Debates into Exile. In episode 1.54, I left the Judeans marching to Babylon. How many marched and how many stayed behind? This is a point of major contention in contemporary biblical studies. The Bible says that there were either 2 or 3 deportations. First, after the initial capture of Jerusalem in 597 BC. Second, after the destruction of the city in 586 BC. And finally, a bonus deportation 5 years later, well into Babylonian rule. The books of Kings and Jeremiah provide figures and dates for the deportations, but they don't agree. In the first deportation, one verse in Kings tells us that 10,000 were deported. In another verse, it tells us that 7,000 were taken. For the second expulsion, the book vaguely says, quote, 2 Kings 25:11, the remnant of the people that was left in the city, the defectors who had gone over to the king of Babylon, and the remnant of the population were taken into exile by Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guards. But some of the poorest in the land were left by the chief of the guards to be vine dressers and field hands. End quote. I've looked up several authorities on how to pronounce that name. Nebuzaradan, Nebuzaradan, Nebuzaradan. Please yourself. Following the Masoretic text, the Jewish Study Bible has translated his title as Chief of the Guards. In the Septuagint, that work translates it as Chief Cook. Okay. Kings also says that most of the remaining population fled to Egypt after the assassination of the first Babylonian governor. The book of Jeremiah quotes precisely 3,846 people taken in the first 2 deportations, and mentions a third deportation, in which a further 745 Judeans were taken to Babylon. Against both Kings and Jeremiah, Chronicles implies that the entire province was depopulated. In saying that, the chronicler is following his own very specific agenda. I'll pursue that in Series 2 of this podcast. The biblical texts are telling us inconsistent stories. We can't tell if just the elites were deported or almost everyone. The Book of Kings talks only about the political elites, warriors and craftsmen. Chronicles throws in everyone down to the poorest peasant. And when the Bible talks about population numbers, you can never know if it is talking about just adult men, or men, women, and children. The best we can say from the Bible's evidence is that somewhere between a few thousand and 20,000 were taken to Babylon. Most scholars think that a very reasonable estimate. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists bought into the chronicler's empty land idea. There was clear evidence of destruction layers in Jerusalem and all the fortified settlements to the south and west. As the Book of Lamentations said, Judah was a desolation, Jerusalem uninhabitable. Judah was also a cultural wasteland. No scribes, no culture, no religious activity. If the Jews were writing books, they were doing it in Babylon, not Judah. In the 1990s, all that got turned on its head. Comprehensive archaeological surveys seemed to indicate that the population of Judah before the Babylonian invasion was something like 75,000, of which Jerusalem contained 15,000. If only 20,000 were deported, then perhaps 3/4 of the people were left behind. By the year 2000, a sizable camp of academics believed that Judah was no wasteland, but a diminished version of the Old Kingdom. All agreed that the city of Jerusalem was almost annihilated. The majority held that rural life and in the towns followed the ancient rhythms of the centuries. Babylon had decimated the great cities and deported a few social elites. But for most of the people, life continued. The religion of Yahweh was alive and well in the land of its birth. To that consensus, there has been a counter-reaction in the past 15 years, a return to the empty land theory. A major issue is that we can find almost no Judean artifacts from the 50 years of the Babylonian rule. Does this mean that the land was devastated, or we just aren't looking hard enough? Archaeologists have one way to test the competing theories. The Babylonians, we think, never conquered the hill country of the old northern kingdom of Israel. Archaeologists have found clear evidence of social continuity in old Israel right through the Babylonian and Persian periods. This gives us a baseline. If the Babylonian conquest was relatively benign, we should find the same continuity in Judah. But we don't. The old 4-room houses and rock-cut tombs vanish from the record, not to re-emerge until the late Persian period, long after the Babylonians were gone. A re-examination of the Judean small towns shows that even they disappeared. Archaeologists have also compared the ruin wrought by the Babylonians on the southern kingdom of Judah with that wrought 140 years earlier by the Assyrians on the northern kingdom of Israel. Most archaeologists now believe that the Babylonians scorched the earth. Judah was left with perhaps 15 to 20% of the population ruled by good King Josiah 30 years before. Still, the debate continues. What archaeology cannot tell us is the reason for the depopulation. How many Judeans were deported? How many died from starvation, disease, plunder, and warfare during the years in which Babylon's armies marched through the land? The Judeans left behind, no matter how many their number, had to adapt themselves to life in a small and insignificant province of a distant imperial master. The Babylonians installed one Gedaliah as their ruler. Gedaliah established his administration at the city of Mizpah in the territory of Benjamin, north of Jerusalem. The Bible does not give him a title, but vaguely describes him as in charge of the province. There are a few hints that he was made king, and that the biblical authors were reluctant to acknowledge that fact. After all, Gedaliah, although Jewish, was not of the house of David. But he was indeed from a very influential family. His Yahwist credentials were impeccable. His grandfather had been in King Josiah's cabinet, and his father in King Jehoiakim's. Gedaliah's father had also supported Jeremiah in counselling submission to Babylon. If we believe the archaeologists, then no Judean in his right mind would have wanted to return to Gedaliah's new world. Yet life was bearable enough that it enticed many of the Judeans who had fled the Babylonian invasion. Amongst these was the prophet Jeremiah. Quote, Jeremiah 49. Gedaliah reassured the officers of the troops in the open country and their men, saying, Do not be afraid to serve the Chaldeans. Stay in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it will go well with you. I am going to stay in Mizpah to attend upon the Chaldeans who will come to us. But you may gather wine and figs and oil, and put them in your own vessels, and settle in the towns you have occupied. Likewise all the Judeans who were in Moab, Ammon, and Edom, or who were in other lands, heard that the king of Babylon had let a remnant stay in Judah, and that he had put Gedaliah in charge of them. All these Judeans returned from all the places to which they had scattered. They came to the land of Judah, to Gedaliah at Mizpah, and they gathered large quantities of wine and figs." End quote. Gedaliah was acceptable to Babylonian sympathizers like Jeremiah, but not to many others. Gedaliah's Judean general Johanan attempted to warn the governor of plots against him. He was ignored. Gedaliah was assassinated by one Ishmael, a distant descendant of the house of David. He ambushed Gedaliah, his court, and his Babylonian advisers with a hit squad of 10 men. It's not clear whether the governor was assassinated only a few months into his rule in 586 BC or after a few years. Jeremiah was horrified. God wanted the Babylonians to conquer Judah. Ishmael was not a freedom fighter, but God's enemy. Ishmael's insurgency was an attempt to thwart God's holy will. Jeremiah records how Ishmael wantonly compounded his blasphemy by slaughtering innocent pilgrims. Quote, Jeremiah 41:4. "The second day after Gedaliah was killed, when no one yet knew about it, 80 men came from Shechem, Shiloh, and Samaria, their beards shaved, their garments torn, and their bodies gashed, carrying meal offerings and frankincense to present at the house of the Lord. Ishmael went out from Mizpah to meet them, weeping as he walked. As he met them, he said to them, 'Come to Gedaliah.' When they came inside the town, Ishmael and the men who were with him slaughtered them and threw their bodies into a cistern." After this fresh carnage, Ishmael and his band made their way towards the kingdom of Ammon, holding retreat as the better part of valour. Johanan intercepted them at Gibeon, a place which in the time of Jeremiah already resonated with ancient acts of violence. Joshua had been tricked into sparing the Gibeonites from genocide during the conquest. If you go back to the story I tell in episodes 1.32 to 1.35, you'll see that Gibeon was the site of many violent events and treacheries during David's reign. Ishmael survived the encounter with Johanan to flee to Ammon and disappear from history. Terrified that the Babylonians would retaliate for Ishmael's attack on their officials, Johanan asked Jeremiah for advice. Should we flee to Egypt? Jeremiah was obdurate. Quote, Jeremiah 42:7. "The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. He said to him, 'If you remain in this land, I will build you and not overthrow. I will plant you and not uproot. For I regret the punishment I have brought upon you. Do not be afraid of the king of Babylon, whom you fear. I will dispose him to be merciful to you. But if you say, no, we will go to the land of Egypt, then hear the word of the Lord, O remnant of Judah. If you turn your faces toward Egypt, and you go and sojourn there, the sword that you fear shall overtake you there in the land of Egypt, and there you shall die. For thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, so will my wrath be poured out on you if you go to Egypt. You shall become an execration of woe, a curse and a mockery, and you shall never again see this place. The Lord has spoken against you, O remnant of Judah. Do not go to Egypt." End quote. In his previous 40 years of preaching, no one had ever followed Jeremiah's foreign policy advice. No one followed it this time either. Quote, Jeremiah 43:4. So Johanan and all the army officers and the rest of the people did not obey the Lord's command to remain in the land of Judah. Instead, Johanan took the entire remnant of Judah, those who had returned from all the countries to which they had been scattered and had sojourned in the land of Judah, men, women, and children, as well as the prophet Jeremiah, and they went to Egypt. They did not obey the Lord. End quote. Johanan had made the right decision. Without saying a word to Jeremiah, God left the Jews to flourish in Egypt for 700 years. Johanan carried Jeremiah kicking and screaming to the land of refuge. We don't know where or when the prophet died. Some believe he was murdered in Egypt, others that he may have ended up in Babylon. What we do know is that before his death, Jeremiah wrote messages of consolation to the Jewish exiles. He promises that the Hebrews will return to Judah, and a king of David will once again rule them. Before Jeremiah, the Old Testament had insisted that Judeans can only be Judeans in Canaan, the land that God gave them. Jeremiah tells the people that they can maintain their relationship with God in a foreign land. He instructs them to build new lives there and wait. As I'll discuss in Series 2, this would provide the exiles with the ideas that would transform the old biblical faith into the religion of Judaism. One of the most influential passages in Jeremiah's book is this. I use the New American Bible Revised Edition translation here, just for a change. Quote, Jeremiah 31:31. The days are surely coming, says Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors, when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, says Yahweh. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Yahweh. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. End quote. Jews interpret this passage as an assurance that Judah will rise again. Christians believe that it is a prophecy of the coming of Jesus, a description of the final covenant that God will make with humanity. The new covenant, they say, talks not of the Jews, but of the followers of Jesus. Another passage that has influenced Jewish ideology for centuries is this. Quote, Jeremiah 32:42. For thus said the Lord, as I have brought this terrible disaster upon this people, so I am going to bring upon them the vast good fortune which I have promised for them, and fields shall again be purchased, in this land of which you say, it is a desolation without man or beast. It is delivered into the hands of the Chaldeans. Fields shall be purchased, and deeds written and sealed, and witnesses called in the land of Benjamin, and in the environs of Jerusalem, and in the towns of Judah, the towns of the hill country, the towns of the Shephelah, and the towns of the Negev. For I will restore their fortunes, declares the Lord. End quote. Jeremiah declares that the Judeans own their land for all time. No temporary interruption, no mere occupation can abrogate that. The land that God gave to Abraham belongs to the Judeans forever, whether they actually occupy it or not. Let a year pass, a decade, a century, a millennium, 2 millennia. The land was and will ever be Judean. Jeremiah has only one theological innovation. I mentioned in episode 1.52 that the book of Isaiah was the first to claim that Yahweh belongs to all the nations, not just the Jews. Jeremiah amps that up by declaring that there is only one God. Quote, Jeremiah 10:6. O Yahweh, there is none like you. You are great, and your name is great in power. Who would not revere you, O King of the nations? But Yahweh is truly God. He is a living God, the everlasting King. Thus shall you say to them, Let the gods, who did not make heaven and earth, perish from the earth, and from under these heavens. Yahweh made the earth by his might, established the world by his wisdom, and by his understanding stretched out the skies. Every man is proved dull without knowledge. Every goldsmith is put to shame because of the idol. For his molten image is a deceit. There is no breath in them. They are a delusion, a work of mockery. In their hour of doom they shall perish. End quote. Jeremiah is said to have written 3 other books. The most accepted of these is the Book of Lamentations, although the book itself does not claim the prophet as its author. The book consists of 5 poems. Lamentations is one of the very shortest books in the Old Testament, coming in at 2,300 Hebrew words. In Christian Bibles, it follows Jeremiah in the prophets. In the Jewish tradition, the book has the splendid title of Alas. It is tucked away in the group called the Scrolls, in the third and least influential division of the Tanakh, the Writings. There it shares happy company with the Song of Songs, Ruth, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. You might call it the miscellaneous shelf. I'm told that the book has some of the most difficult language in the Old Testament, using rare words and the sort of crazy grammar beloved by poets through the ages. It is unlike anything in the book of Jeremiah. Most scholars regard it as the work of later and more sophisticated authors, who had been in Babylon for a generation or so. Still, compared to other biblical books, that places it very close to the events of which it laments. The first chapter sets the tone. Quote, Lamentations 1:1. Alas, lonely sits the city, once great with people. She that was great among nations is become like a widow. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheek wet with tears. There is none to comfort her of all her friends. All her allies have betrayed her. They have become her foes. End quote. And that's the cheeriest chapter. Chapter 4 is a virulent denunciation of Judah's evil, one of the most violent poems in the Bible. Quote, Lamentations 4:2. The precious children of Zion, once valued as gold, alas, they are accounted as earthen pots, work of a potter's hands. Even jackals offer the breast and suckle their young. But my poor people has turned cruel. The young of the suckling cleaves to its palate for thirst. Little children beg for bread. None gives them a morsel. Those who feasted on dainties lie famished in the streets. Her elect were purer than snow, whiter than milk. Their limbs were ruddier than coral. Their bodies were like sapphire. Now their faces are blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. With their own hands, tender-hearted women have cooked their children. Such became their fare in the disaster of my poor people. End quote. The author of Lamentations is in meltdown. God had promised Canaan to the Judeans for all time. Now they were dispossessed and living in a foreign land. God had promised that Jerusalem and the temple would stand forever. Now they lay in smoking ruins. God had promised that the house of David would rule forever. Now that house was reduced to the deposed kings Jeconiah and Zedekiah, languishing in comfortable house arrest in Babylon. The author's head explodes, trying to reconcile the reality with the theological history. With its violent imagery, Lamentations burned the fall of Jerusalem into Judaism's collective memory. Lamentations became the eternal dirge for all Jewish catastrophes. It is read on the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, the 9th day of the month of Av, Tisha B'Av, sometime in July or August. Tradition assigns to that day a vast catalogue of calamities. 2 other works are associated with Jeremiah, the Book of Baruch or Baruch, and the Letter of Jeremiah. Neither work exists in a Hebrew version, only in Greek. The originals were almost certainly in Hebrew. In the prophet's book, Baruch is depicted as Jeremiah's faithful scribe and principal secretary. The book of Baruch is part of the Catholic canon, appearing after Lamentations. The letter of Jeremiah is chapter 6 of that book. In the Orthodox tradition, they are separate books. Protestants usually consider them apocrypha. These are works that may be read for instruction, but not doctrine. Baruch is the only apocryphal book included in the Anglican lectionary, the annual cycle of readings during Advent and Christmas. The Book of Baruch is an amalgam of poetry and history. Baruch portrays himself as speaking from Babylon. His audience is not only the exiles, especially the exiled king Jeconiah, but also those left behind in Judah. He offers words of consolation. A large chunk of Baruch is taken straight from the late book of Daniel. In a departure from any of the wisdom books in the Old Testament, Baruch appeals to national identity and biblical history. Israel must seek God, because God has given his wisdom to Israel through the Torah. Nothing like that is said in the Old Testament. Most scholars now think that the book was 4 or 5 different works, written during the centuries after the Babylonian conquest. They were combined into a single book in the Hellenistic period, in the 1st or 2nd centuries BC. 3 other books were attributed to Baruch. None of them made it into any Bible. I'll cover them in the 2nd series of this podcast. In the next and final episode of this series of the History in the Bible, I wrap up what I've learned while making this show and conduct a survey of the state of the Judean religion just before the exile. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you then.